Hi, welcome to the session on skills needed by an epigraphist in the EpiDoc training program. In this session, we're just really going to have a bit of a conversation between Katherine and myself about some of the skills that go into epigraphic research, not all of which any individual epigraphist has to be expert in, of course, but which as an epigraphist or even as a historian who works with inscriptions, it's really useful to have some sense of and the beginnings of understanding how these things feed into epigraphic understanding of epigraphic materials, in particular, so that if you are not an expert in and don't intend to ever become an expert in any particular of these skills, you know that this is something that you need to ask other people about, that you need to collaborate with people for and discuss with others. So we're just going to sort of throw up a few suggestions and sort of bounce off each other a little bit on this, and hopefully this will be useful as an introduction. So Katherine's going to start us off.
Yeah, so the first thing we wanted to talk about was the language element of it, really. So whatever inscription, whatever set of inscriptions you're working in, whether they're in one language or several languages, it's obviously really important to have a good knowledge of those languages. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because inscriptions are so often fragmentary, they have gaps, you need to be able to guess what word is coming next. And I always have huge admiration for the people who are really excellent at this, particularly in languages where I feel less confident, because it is such a skill. Gabby was just saying before we came on camera, it's like doing a crossword all the time, right? You need those same kind of skills, not to just be able to think of any of the possibilities, but like what is the most likely possibility. So just having read a lot in that language can be really helpful as well. And there's a linguistic element, because often inscriptions may use dialect forms or local words or non-standard spellings that you may be less familiar with. So something that comes up for me is people sometimes ask me, oh, hey, does this, do you think this is a valid spelling for this, or, a non-standard spelling for this? Because even when people are amazing at Latin or Greek, if they're mainly used to standardized modern versions of text, it can be really difficult to spot what's happening in an inscription.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things that you get out of really reading into the language of inscriptions is the way in which, unlike standard Latin or Greek, epigraphic spelling reflects phonetics and the development of phonetics in a really interesting way. So sometimes you can really get a clue as to the historical period of this based on how they're spelling a word, which suggests or what the first language of a second language writer might be, based on how they're pronouncing Greek and Latin words. It can be really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And there's an issue as well from our point of view, where sometimes we label things as erroneous or incorrect spellings, and you sometimes see this in editions. If you've watched the video about Leiden conventions, there are ways of marking that, and sometimes there are genuine mistakes, but a lot of the time actually these things would not have necessarily seemed like mistakes at the time. They would have seemed like not necessarily standard spellings, but not super wrong either. So sometimes we have to have some sociolinguistic awareness to make sure that we're labeling things in the right way and interpreting them in the right way as well.
It's a fair question as to whether there is such a thing as a wrong spelling in this context. If you think of the way Aristophanes spells Greek, maybe for comic effect, but when spoken by people with other dialects, is he spelling it incorrectly? Given that Greek or Latin is something which is a spoken language, or was to the native speakers of it, of course, and therefore it has a correct pronunciation or a standard pronunciation, and the spelling is just a way to communicate that. And so if you're pronouncing it differently, then of course you would spell it differently as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that informs how we interpret the language is obviously the archaeological context as well. What context have we found it in, and what is plausible linguistically in that context. So archaeological context is something you were going to talk about a bit, Gabby, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, epigraphic objects, so the stones or other materials that these texts are written on, are archaeological objects. They're not texts that have survived, over the millennia by being copied and recopied. They're something that survive in a specific archaeological artifact. And so, as epigraphists, one of the things we need to do is to be able to understand how that archaeological status gives context and adds to the interpretation that we need to make of this stone. We need to speak to or work with the epigraphists, the archaeologists who've excavated the object or who've conserved it, or the museum or heritage professionals who've done work with conserving or restoring the objects. Again, we may have those particular expertise ourselves, or we may work with others who have them. So thinking about how do I read this text without damaging it? How do one of the things that we've talked about and we'll talk about in other contexts around epigraphic training is things like squeeze making and other kinds of imaging on there. You really have to think about whether your object is robust enough to be able to image it in that way. Other imaging skills that people have in an archaeological context, but particularly for epigraphy, include photography, different kinds of photography, drawing, other kinds of imaging, including 3D imaging of objects, all of which are particularly relevant to inscribed objects in different ways. And so all of these, again, these are skills that come into epigraphic interpretation, and we either have to have some degree of expertise in those skills, or make sure we're working with people who do, because none of these things are solo projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think nowadays epigraphers are much more likely to think about the object as an archaeological object. I mean, it's people often used to talk about the object as the support, and you hear that a little bit less now, actually, because rather than saying there's a text and it has a support, you actually think about the object as a whole a lot more, I think.
And yeah, the part of that interpretation is, what was this text doing? It's not just what it says and who might have been reading it, but where it was and how readable it was. So you get people who talk about texts that are right up on walls or at the tops of buildings or whatever, and there's all sorts of questions like at what time of day or time of year or ever that was actually legible to people passing. And to come back to the language question, how many people were literate enough to read it in the first place? How large were the letters? All these sorts of things really come into what sorts of tools might have been used in making it, how professional was it, all those sorts of things. These are all archaeological interpretations.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that, again, leads on from that is the next point we were going to talk about is having expertise in historical context as well. So understanding the archaeology, but that obviously has to be informed by your knowledge of the historical period. When you say how professional is this, kind of writing, for example, some people are experts in the kind of official inscriptions that are put up in Athens, and they have a very specific historical context and a very specific set of people doing them. And that's a historical context we know loads about, so that's great, and we can identify individuals, and we know all about the dating that they used in that very specific city, and we know all sorts of other things that are going on at each date, probably in every year of classical Athens. In other places, in other periods, we know much less, but it's equally as important to use what we do know to inform the epigraphic side of things, to inform the archaeological side of things. And it comes right back around to linguistics and things as well. What do we know about the titles that they use, the types of magistrates or officials that they had, the types of naming conventions that they used? That can be hugely important in identifying what kind of person is being talked about, what kind of religious festivals might there have been, what kind of deities are kind of in the mix at this time. because if you know what's normally going on, you can also identify what's interesting and unusual, you know, and what might be due to, you know, some kind of contact or something new appearing or whatever. So all these kind of historical details that are so important as well.
Yeah, I mean that again, that sort of expertise is something that, I mean, in a sense, as classicists and historians, we're used to, you know, having to know a lot about the period we're looking at. But you know, I sometimes, you know, will look at epigraphic editions, and it can be a little bit intimidating to sort of read. Someone says, oh well, this was obviously written in the context of this land dispute in you know 3rd century, and I'm just like, how would anybody know that? Well, I guess nobody knows everything there is to know about that, and you know, it's about reference materials and so forth, which we'll talk about in a bit. But again, and this sort of overlaps with dating, which is what I wanted to talk about next. But one of the most interesting things about onomastics that comes up is just how, you know, obviously we know there are trends in onomastics, and that, you know, certain names go out of fashion and come into fashion, and we see that in the modern period as well, and that might help us to date, you know, individuals and so forth. But sometimes you can date things really specifically based on onomastics in the ancient world. So, for example, if you've got in a city in the Greek East of the Roman Empire, an individual whose name is Marcus Aurelius and then has a Greek cognomen, and his father didn't and wasn't called Marcus Aurelius, then almost certainly this was someone in the 1st generation after Caracalla's citizenship edict. Right, so so everybody in the empire who was a resident of the empire became a citizen and took the emperor's praenomen and gentilicium as part of that citizenship thing. And so you know, that's you know, that sounds like something fairly banal, someone being called Marcus Aurelius, really common set of names, but it can actually date something to you know, within 30 years, which is you know, quite rare if there's no other dating evidence in there. And so yes, as we would say, dating is one of these things that there's all sorts of skills that come into figuring that out. So you have to think about archaeological context, and it may be that, you know, archaeologists will give you that information based on things like stratigraphy or architectural context. There are art historical features, and this is sometimes a point of contention between epigraphists and art historians, because, you know, epigraphists have you know, will tend to still, I think, although as Katherine says, the state it's getting a little bit better than it used to, they will tend to focus on the text, and so what textual features give us information about the dating and other things related to this inscription. And art historians will tend to focus, you know, on anything but the text primarily. And you know, I've seen conversations about the same text, the same stone, the same inscription, I should say, not just text, where, you know, the art historian has said, well, clearly because of the hairstyle of the female figure on this sarcophagus, and the epigraphist has said, well, clearly because of some textual features. Whether that's, you know, paleography or onomastics or you know, political content or whatever, titulature of an emperor, it's such and such a date. And you know, the hairstyle of an empress, that doesn't, you know, you can't actually consider that to be a particularly, you know, concrete date. And the art historian is saying, well, the epigraphists are just basing this on this really woolly paleography. And actually each has a really, you know, really clear case. You know, the art historical information about hairstyles can help you date things to a quarter of a century or less. You know, fashions, you know, a particular hairstyle was only used after the empress, whoever made it popular, right? These sort of things can be really, really clear. And, you know, not all epigraphic dating is paleographical. So you know, there can be a lot of, you know, contention or even conflict in terms of this. I've seen people date things, you know, 100 years apart, because they're not looking at a broad enough range of contexts. And so, you know, paleographical features, spelling, dialects, phonetics, the sorts of things that Katherine was talking about, you know, nomenclature, as we just talked about, historical events that might either be directly alluded to, that's easy, or that you know, you can read in the text that this must have taken place after such and such historical event, because because of the way in which certain things are, are mentioned or assumed, or because where the text is, it's an Athenian text, but it's in a place that was outside of the Athenian sphere of influence until such and such a date, whatever, these sorts of things that again, understanding this sort of range of things, or at least having access to those things, is really important for being able to read in the broad sense of read and inscription.
Yeah, definitely. In my field, which is obviously Italic languages, letter shapes become so important, but equally are really, really difficult to interpret. As much as you try and fit them into a system, they're not always going to fit into an exact system. So yeah, our ideas of accurate dating are much broader than someone working on Athens, for example.
And you have to, you really have to combine a lot of these things, because so many things like, linguistics or paleography and so forth, can be really, really useful and can sometimes give you very concrete ideas. But there's also, we know there's a tradition that I think has always been present in especially in epigraphy, of archaizing. So people will in the first century deliberately write in a third century hand. All sorts of sort of weird things. You got inscriptions that written in the 2nd century CE that are deliberately written in a 5th or 6th century BCE dialect. All sorts of things that can throw us off if we don't look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, definitely, because they could see some of the older stuff, right? We've got to remember that they didn't have access to the stuff that was going to be in the future, but they did have access to some of the stuff that was in the past, of course. So yeah, it's anyway, so there's all sorts of things to consider with dating, and I think this brings us on partly to what we're going to say about reference materials, because I find, particularly for dating, I think it's really difficult to have in your head all the things, I always think of things like consular dates in Rome. Does anyone actually know these off the top of their head, apart from maybe a couple of really specific ones? Reference works that can give you access to things like consular dating or other kinds of eponymous dating really help you, or prosopographies that help you with that. All kinds of ancient calendars like the Praenestine Fasti and things like that, where you get some kind of reference to, like, oh yes, this happened in this year and things like that, or this festival is on this day. So sometimes these can help you out, right? Even kind of ancient reference works. But there's all sorts of obviously kind of modern print resources as well. There's something that people might be aware of. Normally I sort of hold it up at this point, but I don't think I have it in this room, is the Guide de l'epigraphiste, which is a sort of bibliography. I think actually the latest edition of it is now from about 2014, I think, but there is an online update to it. So there is, there's just a kind of bibliography, so you can look up something like a place like Delos and find lots of the main works about Delos, or you could look up something like we're talking about, like magistracies, Roman magistracies, and find some of the main works about that. So that's a kind of reference work that will lead you to other reference works, I guess. We were also talking the other day, weren't we, about like reverse lexicons and things that help you to look up words in unusual ways. So not just looking up the beginnings of the words in dictionaries, but looking up resources that allow you to look up the ends of words if you needed to fill in a gap there. So all sorts of ways of accessing all the information we've been talking about so far, and it doesn't all need to be in your head at all times. Particularly, these things that are essentially very long lists of material. So lots of possibilities for finding the information you need, as well as obviously collaborating with other people. Another important one, of course, is like corpora of text that already exists. Sometimes you find something and you're like, what is this? But it can be possible to try and find such a text, figure out what it actually is. Online stuff like Trismegistos is obviously hugely helpful for some kinds of lookups. But sometimes print corpora are the way to go if you know where something is from and what language it's in. You might be able to narrow it down that way as well. So lots of different resources you could use. And
in some ways, the digital corpora have have replaced in some ways some of the print corpora, in particular in the ease of finding things. So the reverse lexicon that I first came across when with papyrologists in the 1990s, who very, very concerned about how do you look up, I know 6 letters of this word, but the first 1, 2, or 3 letters are clearly lost. How would you ever look that up? And of course, with search, that's much easier. You can just do a wildcard search. You can just say, I want any word that ends with this string of letters, and and ignore the first few, and so forth. So in some sense, search has done away with the need for some of the these more advanced lexical tools and corpora, and it's much easier to search in something like the epigraphic database Heidelberg, or some of the other epigraphic databases out there for either Latin or Greek, than it is to find something in CIL, say. But at the same time, the one thing that the print corpora have always done really, really well, that I've yet to see a digital resource replace, is indexing. Really indexing in a scientific way, in a way that has involved scholarly intervention and listing officers and rulers, emperors, or whatever, by date rather than just alphabetically, all this sort of thing, which is really really useful as a reference resource.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like indexes of different types of names, because when you're reading something and you're not familiar with it, you might not be sure whether something is a human name or a deity name or what. And some of the best corpora have that all indexed, so you can look up actually what kind of name you're dealing with.
Yeah. And the final thing then, I mean, I've mentioned digital corpora a little bit, but the final thing that I wanted to bring up, perhaps unsurprising to people who know me, is the importance for an epigraphist of knowing some digital skills. It's increasingly important now for epigraphists of the current generation to know something like Epidoc or other digital humanities skills for publishing and processing and interpreting inscriptions, for the next generation of Epidoc-led publications really can combine the best of the sort of digital corpora we've been talking about and the human indexed print corpora that we just mentioned, by being able to embed this sort of information semantically in the text and generate these rich indices out of them, along with just raw plain text searching, which has its own incredible power. So there are skills for related to publication, various kinds of database processing, philological technologies such as grammatical parsing, but also encoding the relationships between dialect forms and the more standard form, the more standard lemma that you would normally look up in a dictionary. And in the digital realm, it's particularly obvious, and we've been saying this throughout, but like I say, it's particularly important in the digital realm that we think about collaboration. In some ways, it would be silly to try and do a large epigraphic corpus without collaboration, in the analog world either, but in the digital world even more so. Even if you have all the digital humanities skills you think you need, and even if you have all the linguistic, archaeological, historical, and other skills that you think you need, still there's always going to be value in collaboration, and different people focusing on different parts of a corpus, on different parts of a publication, and so and all sorts of different skills that you might not know you need that other people can bring to the table. So that's really more of a call to know the field rather than to try and become expert in every single thing you need to be able to complete a project.
Yeah, definitely. And also to collaborate with, people around you and get to know other people around you who are interested in overlapping things, because they may well be great collaborators for a future project that you come up with. So a call for, all working together on some of these big projects. I think all the big epigraphy projects now are all, multi-person teams, often multi-year, people kind of coming in and out as they're needed. And and I think that's really great. There's a lot of opportunities. for more of that kind of thing at the moment.
Yeah, and I guess my last sort of call on the question of collaboration is just to bear in mind that anything we've said is an important skill. That suggests that the person who's part of your team who's providing that skill is an important person, which may sound like an obvious thing to say. I think if you were a Latin historian, Roman historian, specialized in Latin epigraphy, and you're working on a group of inscriptions, one of which was in a Paleo-Italic language, and you were not familiar with, you might speak to someone like Katherine, who's an expert in those languages, and collaborate on the edition of that particular text with them. And you wouldn't dream of not bothering to put Katherine's name on it, just because the rest, that she's only an Italic expert after all. So likewise, if you've got a digital expert doing part of your corpus for you, that person needs to be co-author, on at least to the extent to which they've made. We all understand that someone might have done 80% of the work and only a few of the texts have been contributed to by this person. Likewise, for digital things, that might be the case. But you do need to really think. I've got I want to do this entire corpus in Epidoc, but I can't be bothered to learn it. Therefore, I'm going to hire a research assistant who's going to do all the Epidoc for me. But that person's not going to be a co-author. That's not only is that a bit silly, it's intellectually dishonest to do that. Just you wouldn't do that with any other kind of skills. So yeah, that's I think an incredibly important lesson to take from this. None of us do anything on our own, and the people who help us do it are providing part of the research.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great place to finish. A call for collaboration, but also for proper credit for all your collaborators as well, who are helping with all these different skills that we've talked about today.
Great. Thank you.